It was an unseasonably warm, sunshiny day in Oxford, England, and I was standing in front of the house. The house where C.S. Lewis and Joy Davidman, his wife, had lived. And as I put my hand on that front door and opened the door to walk inside, my mind went back to the reason I was there. In 2002, I had begun my graduate studies in solo performance at a university that, well, conservative doesn't quite describe it for you. This university had a few professors that were pushing edges and pushing boundaries, and I was waiting to find out who my private lessons teacher would be. Now, my private lessons teacher would be the person who would guide me toward my final project, a one-person performance called a recital that was the equivalent of a thesis in different grad school programs. And there was one person I wanted to be my teacher. He was trying all sorts of new things with performance. But when I got the paper, my teacher was not the person I had hoped for. The person I received was a very proper, very feminine, very conservative teacher whose makeup was always perfect, who had on earrings that were just the right size, not too big and not too small. And I decided I was going to make the best of the situation. And the first thing I started doing was trying to brainstorm with her an idea for my performance. And the first one I threw out there was an idea about the Salem witch trials and trying to dive in deep into the thinking of the people who were involved there. And she looked at me and she said, "Sarah, the Puritans were good people. You can't tell that story. It will make them look bad." And I realized we were at an impasse. And so I started trying to brainstorm something where we might be able to meet. And then it came to me. There are lots of brilliant women who are overshadowed by their more famous husbands. And that led me to C.S. Lewis and his wife, Joy Davidman, or Jack and Joy, as their friends called them. And as I read about them, I was enchanted. Jack and Joy would sit and play Scrabble, and they play Scrabble using all the languages from any dictionary that was in the house along the walls. And Joy would tear apart his stories and edit them and make them better. And she'd tear apart his logic and make it more sound. And I came to my teacher with this idea, and she was relieved. She said yes. But then I had to convince the rest of the department. And that was more difficult. One male professor looked at me and said, "Sarah, C.S. Lewis married a divorced woman. That means he might have been living in sin. They both might have. I'm not sure this is a good story to tell." Then another female professor said, "Sarah, Joy's brash. She's bold. She's from the Bronx. She's not ladylike like we're trying to teach you to be." But I kept pushing and fighting for Jack and Joy while taking all the classes I needed for completing my degree. And some of those classes were taught by the professor I had hoped would be my private lessons teacher. Now, I made A's in all of his classes and always received good feedback. But after class, he wouldn't really talk to me. He wouldn't mentor me the way he did my male counterparts. And sometimes I was in very small classes with him, classes that were just him, the professor, a single male student, and me. And in some of those classes, he'd say things like, "Stories about men are inherently more interesting than stories about women." And it was just him, and me. Or he'd say, "You know, women should be grateful to men for giving up some of their own power to them so they can have some. And it was just him and me. But I kept on going, and finally the day of my recital was there, and I performed, and there was thunderous applause, and afterwards there was a line of people waiting to talk with me. And my professor was there. And he had a look on his face that I had never seen directed toward me. And when he stood in front of me, he said words that were embedded into my brain. Sarah, your recital was magnificent in concept and performance. And I felt like maybe I'd earned the right to be mentored by him a little bit. And so I set up a meeting with him, and I went to his office to talk with him about what I hoped to do once I graduated from grad school. And I walked in and I sat down and I opened the door to my heart just a little bit and let out just a few of my dreams of performing in schools and doing shows about history and literature, and then performing in religious places and other locations. And he just looked at me. Sarah, there's no market for that. No one will pay you to do that. No one will follow you from place to place. If you really want to go into schools, you're going to have to figure out some sort of assembly that will be for a performance for some sort of assembly that's in front of large audiences that the schools care about, like drugs. And I looked around and I saw that he had dropped my dreams all over the floor. And they lay there broken. And he didn't even seem to notice. But I wanted to believe that he was trying to help me. And so I tried to track with what he was saying. And I pulled from my brain an article I just read. And I said, well, I did read an article recently about how high schools are struggling with students that are experiencing violence and dating relationships. Maybe I could do an assembly about that. And he looked at me. No, Sarah. Drugs. And I knew that our meeting was over. I reached over and I picked up my shattered dreams from the floor and I put them back in my heart, and then I thanked him for the 7 to 10 minutes he'd sacrificed for me. And then I left. And when the door clicked shut behind me, I stood in the hallway collecting myself. And I prayed. And I said, God, if you want me to do what I think I'm supposed to do, you're going to have to open the doors for me. In fact, you're going to have to even show me where the doors are, because there is no one in my life who is willing or able to do that for me. And then I left it. I kept walking through graduation and then into a job working as a drama producer for distance education, and then into another job teaching at the university level, communications and theater. And then somebody walked into my life and told me I should be a storyteller. And after some convincing, I began to walk down that path, which led me to that moment in England in 2014 when I stood at that house and I opened the door and I walked inside and I stepped through those rooms where these two great tellers of stories had lived and loved and created and grieved. And at the end of the tour guide said, C.S. Lewis wasn't a man who faced no obstacles or had no pain in his life. He was someone who just did what he was supposed to do and trusted that God would take care of the rest. And at that moment, it was as though someone had reached their hand inside my chest and squeezed my heart. And that door popped open again. And then the words reverberated inside my head, but personalized for me. All I'm supposed to do is what I'm supposed to do. And I'm supposed to be a teller of stories. And I realized then that I could see the doors. And some of them were swinging open. And I sat as long in that moment as I could, feeling as though I'd stepped into sacred space. And as I walked out the door toward my future, it seemed to me that Jack and Joy had somehow reached through time and fought for me the way I'd fought for them all those years before.